Okay, this is my lecture on imperialism in India. When we think about imperialism in India, we really need to think of primarily just one country, and that country is the British. The country of England took over uh, pretty much all of India, but they took it over in stages. But pretty much by the 1850s or so, pretty much all of India was taken over by the British. Okay, so let's talk about it. All right, you have in the very beginning, you have what's called a company called the British East India Company, and it was an actual company, and they went and did trading in places like Bombay, and Madras, and Calcutta over here. And they started out as a trading company, and over time, because of the weak infrastructure of the Mughal Empire, they basically were able to take it over. Okay, and they have dozens of small states, each handled by a ruler, and they kind of brokered them off to one another, and they kind of played each other off one another, and they eventually, this company was able to dominate the political and economic situation in India for a very long time. Okay, and here's the British East India Company, um, and of course you can see here on the map where you have where they've taken over and where they haven't, and then of course here's some of the soldiers that they used to facilitate that. All right. So during the 17 and 1800s, the East India Company slowly took over India, as I already mentioned. Okay, and they built up their own military force. So you actually had a company called, again, the British East India Company that pretty much ran India as their own little fiefdom. They had a military force and a military presence. They had the political strength and the military power to back it up. All right, and they called these soldiers sepoys. Okay, they were Indian soldiers led by British commanders, and even though they're very good soldiers, the British commanders and the British company didn't really think too much of them, and they were made up primarily of Hindus and Muslims, and that's going to be important, as we'll see in just a minute. All right, so what are the British doing there in India? Well, it's primarily because of the raw materials that India had. They had cotton, they had indigo, they had burlap, um, they had spices and sugar. Um, and I mean, India was ripe for the pickings when it came to raw materials. Um, the other thing is that the British, so what the British would do is that they would get all these raw materials, they would ship it back to England, and of course they would use all the factories in the Industrial Revolution to make whatever products they were going to make, and then they would ship these products all throughout the colonies and in some cases back to India for the Indians to buy it. And so, and of course, India had a large population as well to buy all these products. So, from the British perspective, it's a win-win all the way around. For the Indians, not so much. What are some advantages, though, that the British invasion gave India? Well, they gave them railroads and education and hospitals. They gave them a common language, i.e. English. But also the disadvantages were that, of course, the people had low wages, they had few rights, they had no say in their government, and large portions of the population, because they were making raw materials and they weren't making food products, they actually starved to death. Okay, but let's talk about who the sepoy were. 96% of the company's army of 300,000 men in India were native to India. All right, the British believed that they were superior and looked down upon their dark-skinned patriots. In the military, sepoys could not be promoted to higher ranks, and the British did not respect Indian culture or religious traditions and beliefs, and that's going to lead to the Sepoy Rebellion. Um, and so what is the Sepoy Rebellion? Well, it's kind of started out all because of, well, military cartridges, and I'll explain what that is in a minute. But the Sepoy Mutiny starts in 1857, and what happened was is that the British government issued these bullet cartridges to their troops. Okay, but the bullet cartridges were rumored to be greased with cow or pig grease, and so to keep the bullets fluid and to keep them from getting all rusty or to keep them lubricated, they put this kind of grease in them. And what they would do is they would package them in these kind of this hard grease, and then over time, of course, what would happen is it kind of preserve the bullets in this cartridge, and then you'd bite off the top of the cartridge, which would either be the cow or the pig grease, and you'd stick it into the rifle, and then of course you'd fire it. But cows and pigs are both sacred or unholy to Muslims and Hindus, and so obviously the sepoys soldiers refused to use these bullets, and because they were refusing to use the bullets, it looked upon that they were being insubordinate to the British, and the British obviously didn't care about their religious or cultural practices, and so this led to a rebellion. And so over time, this of course led to a lot of resentments between the sepoy soldiers and their commanders, and just within a short amount of time, you had a whole bunch of these soldiers rebelling, and of course, because of the political tension that was going on in India, it just blew up into a big, huge mutiny riot. Okay, so the sepoy troops that refused to use these cartridges, they were put on trial, and some of them were executed, some of them were put in jail. Some of the sepoy soldiers tried to rescue them, and of course by doing so they killed a whole bunch of Europeans in the process, and then from there it just escalated into full-blown mutinies and riots throughout India. And here you have a picture of the gun being used, and the wax seal right here, and the bullets, and of course as you can see the soldiers biting off the grease here and stuffing the powder and the bullet into the gun and the muzzle of the gun, and then so on. Okay, and I think this is, I'm not trying to illustrate, a gun here, but I'm trying to illustrate this is what the soldiers were asked to do. And if this grease down here is filled with something that they consider unholy or against their cultural beliefs, they're obviously not going to use this cartridge. And of course, from the British perspective, it looks like they're disobeying orders. So the British finally suppressed the rebellion, and the British government finally has to come in and establish order, and at that point they basically say to the British East India Company, thank you very much, it's been a great partnership, but we're going to release you from your obligations of this big huge subcontinent, and we're going to rule ourselves. And so India became a British colony, and in 1877 Queen Victoria took over, and she became what's known as the Empress of India. And of course now India is directly controlled by the British Crown and not a trading company. Alright, and here you can see where the people that were involved in the mutiny, okay, were not treated very kindly by the British, or here as well. Alright, so what about the British East India Company that you should know? Up until this time, they pretty much had little interference from the British government. The company even had its own army, like I mentioned before, with its own officers. Most of the troops were Hindus or Muslims. About 1 in 6 were British, yet only the British could become officers, and that was a turning point for this army that they had, because it caused a lot of resentment by these Indians. Alright, economic restrictions that were placed. The British held much of the political and economic power. British policy called for India to produce raw materials instead of food crops, okay, which would be a problem. I mean, you can produce a whole bunch of cotton, but obviously, and of course that cotton is going to be shipped back to England or the British factories, but in a lot of those places where the cotton is being grown, before you were having food being grown. And so the British came in and they said, you know what, we don't care whether you're growing food or not, we want you to grow cotton. So they grew cotton, and of course the cotton left. They got very little money for it. And of course, because there wasn't a lot of food being grown, the prices of food went up, and a lot of people unfortunately couldn't pay for the food, and so they starved. In addition, Indian competition with British goods was prohibited. So you could have had um, Indians making cloth during this time period in India at a cheaper price, but the British also came in and said, you know what, you cannot make cloth anymore. All Indians need to buy it from the British. So that protected the British companies, but at the same time, obviously those Indian companies were shut out, and of course they lost everything that they had. And of course, Indians had to raise cash crops, like I said, and of course they couldn't plant what they wanted. So this caused a lot of famine and hardship. What else did you should know? Let's see here. But there wasn't always some bad things. I mean, the British did some good things in India as well. They made the third largest railroad network and accomplished that. They made roads in India. The railroads allowed the British to transport raw materials from the interior to the exterior. The majority of the raw materials were agricultural products made on big, huge plantations. The other thing that we'll talk about later on in our discussion with China is that in India they produced a lot of opium, and this opium was shipped to China in exchange for tea and other goods. But we'll talk more about that when we talk about China. All right. So we got a railroad system, modern telecommunication system, irrigations, dams, telephone lines, bridges, irrigation systems. You also have education system, sanitary conditions in India improved as well. So there was some positives that came out of the British taking over India, but there was also a lot of negatives as well. All right, and again, the British set up schools and colleges for higher education, but it was again the educational system was English only, and it was only English culture, and they really did a good job of suppressing Indian culture for quite some time. Alright, so that's your guys' notes about imperialism in India. A couple of things, just major things that you should remember is that when you think of imperialism in India, think British. You should think of the Sepoy Rebellion and why it occurred, and the positives and negatives that came along with that. Alright, thanks for watching.